Hello. Simon says grab a wrench. Today we're going to pack some bearings and turn some rotors. First thing we need to do is get that caliper off. So we're going to have to get this brake line out of the way. For some reason they made it a solid line between the caliper and where the brake line is held. So if we cut this open and bend it, we can slip it out without having to open up the brake line and do bleeding brakes and all that mess. Now under those nuts are two washers. There's just a regular flat washer, and then there's a tapered washer. And it doesn't always just come out by itself. It can actually pop out after you tap it. So look out. And that's the cone-shaped washer in there. Sometimes you can pull them off with pliers. Sometimes you need to tap them a little bit. And there's the rest of your locking hub. All that does is lock the axle to the hub so that your drivetrain can turn that wheel. Now the top nut is a locked nut by that tab there. So you have to bend that out of the way. And then you can release the locking bolt or nut. Now this socket's really pretty big, so I just use a screwdriver and a hammer. Knock it out of the way. Okay, there's the nut. Now this is the locking tab that holds the bolt. Now here's the actual nut that puts pressure on the bearing. So it creates a sandwich. One more washer and then the bearing. Now don't do this. I just dropped the washer and the bearing on the ground. But there's your bearing, and there's the washer that goes in front of it. This is the front bearing, the outer bearing, and there's also an inner bearing. So the way I pull that off, I set the nut on there, then I use like a slide hammer action to pull the back bearing out, and it also usually pulls the seal out very nicely. And it actually works very well on this one. Be sure not to knock that nut against the bearing race. There's your back bearing and your seal. Now if you're turning the rotors at this point, you got to make sure your rotors are thick enough and have enough material to machine. Now let's get into cleaning these bearings. You know, if you can't get these bearings real clean, don't use any sort of cleaner like this. Just go ahead and wipe them down the best you can and put the new grease in. I'm going to take the time to clean them real well since I have the time and the tools. Now here's the old school method of packing bearings. You're just shoving it in on the palm of your hand, and the grease will actually work between those rollers. I don't know if you can see it there, but it's actually coming out between the rollers. Takes a while. And you can see how the grease is between those rollers. Little by little. There's also specialty tools you can buy that'll do this, But if you're not doing this all the time, it's really not worth buying all those tools. Now we can just fill in every kind of groove we can with grease. Get it on the outside of the bearing. Now I turn these rotors, so the rotor faces need to be cleaned. Also the bearing faces, races need to be cleaned. Okay, now we can start assembly. I'm going to put some grease on the bearing race. And then also on the bearing itself, and then place it in there. Fill in all the grooves. And now I'm putting a new seal in. Just real carefully tap it. Get it in there real evenly. Take your time. This isn't always real easy. It's good to put just a real light coat of grease on that rubber seal before you put it in. Just a real light coat. That's the same thing on the front bearing. You've got the bearing race already covered with grease, the bearing covered in grease. Fill in the grooves. Now this is a bit of an art. You really have to have some feel for this. How tight do you make this bolt? So I put it in there and make sure the rotor doesn't rock back and forth. Every time you tighten it down a little bit, it's good to turn the rotor. Kind of gets that grease and the bearing settled in with one another. You'll find that you can get a little more out of it. Now I'm not going real tight on this. Now I'm turning that rotor back and forth just like my fingers were going. If you feel any rocking or anything, you need to tighten it up a little bit more. So just to make sense of this, I'm going to loosen it a little bit. And now when I rock it back and forth, I can feel a little bit of rocking. So tighten it back up until the rocking goes away. And maybe just a little more snug than that. I'd really suggest putting the wheel on with maybe 2 bolts. Give you the leverage. Make sure that rocking is completely gone. Okay, at this point I don't feel any rocking. So we can go just a little bit tighter, not much. If you over tighten this, it could destroy it. Just want to get a little bit. Now we're going to start with the locking washer. And the outer locking nut goes on. Now we can bend one of the tabs over to ensure that that nut is locked in place. Pick the one that's most directly in the middle. That one looks great. I'm going to do that one. Just bend it up against the nut. Now we can do some general cleaning and get ready to install the hub, the locking hub. Now I'm just pointing out the alignment pins. You got the cone-shaped washer that goes in first. On all 6 bolts. Next we have the washer. All 6 washers go on there. And then the 6 bolts. Now you want to use a crisscross pattern when you tighten these down. Okay, now let's test it. With the hub in lock position, our rotor turns with the axle. Now we'll unlock it, and the rotor turns free of the axle. Works great. Let's put the caliper on. Now we got to work with that solid brake line while we put this caliper on. And we're not going to do brake pads in this video. We'll do that in a different video. Now we can bend this tab back into place. And align it so the retainer slips right back in. And that should be it. Thanks for watching.